Hello.
Well, hello and good morning.
Morning.
You are frozen to me. Oh, there you are. In living color. Look at that.
Yeah.
Yay.
We have a crackle.
Okay, so I will speak quickly. Good
No,
morning.
you don't have to speak quickly. Just mute when you're done speaking and we'll get it.
Okay.
No need to speak quickly. And good morning to you.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. And good morning to the women who will come up and the men too who are always so silent, but I know you're here. We have some really good questions today, Dr. Rosensweet. Thank you for being here.
Oh, you're welcome.
Always a pleasure.
Yes.
So, it is. It is. It really is. So let me start.
All
Question
right.
number one. If we decide to stop our hormone replacement therapy, will our bodies go back to where they were originally, or will we have permanently altered something?
It's a great question. Um, I wouldn't say they go back to where they were, but what happens is all the good stuff that these hormones promote disappears. For example, hormones, ovarian hormones, estrogens, progesterone, testosterone, they keep the bones healthy. And without them, you wind up losing bone and getting something called osteopenia, then osteoporosis. And if you've been on hormones for 20 years in menopause, the moment you stop those hormones, you start getting into major bone loss. In Grand Rounds next week, that's when I gather together with a group of healthcare providers who are specializing in menopause. The very first thing I'm going to present is a comparison bone mineral density. The woman had decent bones and then she stopped her hormones, and 3 years later, she has very significant osteoporosis. Big one. Bones is only one of the many, many benefits and crucial importance of these most powerful biochemicals, these ovarian hormones. Protection of the arteries, protection of the brain, skin, vagina, on and on and on. You stop those hormones, and all these degenerative processes just proceed as they ordinarily would if you never went on hormones. And as we've said many times, your life is going to matter to you at the age you're at, and when you're 70, 80, 90, it's going to matter to you just as much as it does right now in this moment. And I can't help but overemphasize that best thing you can do is not lose things. Don't lose bone, don't lose muscle, don't lose thinking ability. Yes, it is possible to stop the deterioration progression by proper treatment. And yes, at times it's even possible to restore function, even something so significant as muscle strength loss, sarcopenia, and many others. But it's not a guarantee. And the very best thing any of us can do is catch it early and treat it early, and treat it every single day that you are on the planet Earth. This is my testosterone. I've got a few other things that I take for andropause. And my plan, the divine willing, is to take it every single day. I get to wake up on this glorious life and this glorious planet we're on. And do I recommend that for women? Woo-hoo-hoo! Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop. The only reason the stoppage thing came in was because some false, incorrect lie, I'm going there so far as to say that Women's Health Initiative in 2002 published wrong data. Even in the published study, it said that it is statistically insignificant risk. That means there is no increased risk. But that's not what the press got hold of, and it just poisoned the minds of women all over the world and also healthcare providers that there was increased risk. Otherwise, there'd be probably very little reluctance or any motivation whatsoever to stop taking hormones that you went on in menopause. Without that body blow that took place from that study, falsely reported study, it's falsely reported. Never should have been published. Statistically insignificant. That original study committee retracted that big scare in 2017 by publishing that after 18 years of follow-up of the 16,000 women plus or minus that were in that study, they were on hormones. There was no increased risk of breast cancer, heart attack, and stroke. Without that false information in 2002, I doubt that there would be very many women who would want to stop their hormones, or if they stopped them, that once they started experiencing some of the losses, they wouldn't want to leap back on them. So take them forever. And don't stop, or there's going to be a high probability that you're going to wind up with everything you'd wind up with in menopause that goes slowly so you don't notice it. It's not like stopping a blood pressure medicine and then in a few days, for many people, you're going to start seeing elevated blood pressures. It doesn't happen that fast. Bone loss occurs molecule by molecule by molecule, but 3 years later, you got osteoporosis. That's a big deal. Muscle loss takes place molecule by molecule, but 3 years later, or a certain amount of time later, you got sarcopenia. You're getting weak in the lower extremities. You may have to get eventually into a cane, walker, and wheelchair, assisted living, nursing home, adult diapers. Don't stop. Keep taking them. And get them prescribed in an excellent fashion by someone who's specializing in this work. So they do a really good job. And once they do that initial good job, it's not rocket science to maintain this for the whole rest of your life.
Yeah, I hear in that question fear, and I do unfortunately see here where I live and work exactly what you just said, and I'm totally powerless. Not totally, but somewhat. And
It's hard to antidote the scare. That scare was so profound and so universal and so false that once someone gets afraid of breast cancer, well, here's the science. We've repeated this many times, but I don't think it can be repeated too much. I'm a medical doctor. I know that there are thousands of diagnoses that all of us could achieve, could get declared upon us of many, many, many possible biological dysfunctions / illnesses / severe illnesses. And a lot of those are not, they're not pretty. They're really life debilitating, and some of them take our life. Thousands of diagnoses. And then amongst those diagnoses, all of us, men and women, we're all vulnerable to cancers. Hundreds of them. And as a male, I have a special increased relative risk for prostate cancer. And there are reasons for that. Lose prostate health, challenge prostate health, set up unfavorable conditions in the prostate, and cancer is one of the possibilities. Women have an increased risk amongst other cancers for breast cancer. There's reasons for this. Accumulation of toxicity in the breast, multidimensional reasons, such as giving away too much energy. That's a story. Someday we should get into that one, Carolyn. But the bottom line is, cancer has a lot of causes. Oh boy, they do, but they're not hormones. Here's the science. Women who are treated with hormones in menopause are at less risk for breast cancer, heart attack, and stroke than women who are not treated with hormones. Analogy is the same for men. Men who are treated with testosterone and andropause are at less risk for prostate cancer than men who are untreated with testosterone. This even goes so far is that women who have had breast cancer and had that breast cancer properly treated, they happen to be at an elevated risk for recurrence of that breast cancer than a woman who's never had breast cancer is for getting breast cancer. However, women who have had breast cancer, had that breast cancer properly treated, are at less risk for recurrence of that cancer if they are treated with hormones than if they are not treated with ovarian hormones. That's how far it goes.
I've
Hormones
got
are
to
not,
say, yeah, I relate to that well, and I find much solace and safety in what you're saying. So thank you.
doesn't mean that we're not at risk. There's thousands of causes that occur over the course of a life to get us ill. Issues of nutrition, toxicity, inappropriate exercise, and the elephant in the room, the biology of the stress response that's exaggerated and excessive, fight or flight biology. And then there's mysterious causes, and those are the 5 causes of cancer and any significant illness. Notice I didn't list hormones as part of that cause. So I'm emphasizing this because it was that fear that was given to the women all over the world and to healthcare providers all over the world. That's what came up with this notion of, well, we shouldn't take hormones very, very long, or if we do, we should take very small amounts of them. That's incorrect. And I'm going to give you my best shot. Get on hormones as soon as you can think about it. That could be your 30s, your 40s, and stay on them for the rest of your life. Doesn't get better than that. One of the things on next week's grand rounds, because we reviewed it last week, was a doctor asked about, is it okay to treat an older woman who hasn't been treated? And I say, and I gave the last week, that was yesterday actually, I gave the expanded explanation of how important it was. But next week I'm going to reemphasize it, because the earlier and more excellent and exact we get to treat someone prior to the development of weight gain, loss of libido, vaginal atrophy, bone loss, sarcopenia, the earlier we get to deal with that, the greater chance we have of arresting any decline and even restoring some of the losses. Yes, it's fine to treat a woman at any age. I've many times told the story of treating my mother-in-law at 86 and getting some of her muscle strength back. But the ideal thing is start early and stay on them forever. That's my best shot.
Well, okay then. Um, your best shot is excellent in my, as you say, humble, non-humble opinion. You are frozen to me, but I don't think that you're frozen to anybody else. So that is just fine.
Would someone tell us about that in the chat if I'm frozen there?
Yeah, please. Nobody said anything thus far. Um, I always like to interact with you, but I have you in this one still position. Okay, not frozen, so that's good. All right. Well, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Um, so we have a couple of sex hormone binding globulin questions, and this one comes in saying, if my SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, is climbing, does that mean by using more estrogen will actually look less feminine or get hot flashes? Because in a sense, we're really not getting as much estrogen as we should because it's all bound up.
Yeah, that's one way to explain it. I'd like to take it into even a more elaborate explanation and start with what sex hormone binding globulin is. steroid hormones produced by the ovary and the adrenals, there's a bunch of them, they're fat soluble. That means when that gland, the ovary or the adrenal glands, produce steroid hormones, and here I'm talking about estrogen and testosterone and progesterone and DHEA and cortisol. When these glands produce these fat-soluble hormones, they can't just dump them into the bloodstream because they're fat. They're fat-soluble. They behave like oil and vinegar does. The oil floats on top of the vinegar. They'd be floating around in the bloodstream. There's reasons why that doesn't work, including fat embolus. So don't do that. Well, the body is so astoundingly, incredibly, mind-bogglingly, incomprehensibly, beautifully, technically designed. It's just outrageous. So when the ovaries, for example, put out estrogen, for example, or testosterone, they go into the bloodstream and they're immediately bound up to plasma proteins so that they can be linked to those proteins, and that's how they're transported around in the bloodstream. Analogous to how cholesterol is fat, how it's transported around in the bloodstream, it's bound to plasma proteins, these lipoproteins. And then when the estrogen reaches its target cells, of which there's a zillion, that's more than a trillion. I think there's only trillions. It gets unbound. It gets released into the cell. And there's a list of plasma proteins that carry steroid hormones. One of the most prevalent and specifically designed to carry steroid hormones is a hormone that's named sex hormone binding globulin. Globulin's a plasma protein. You may have heard of them. Albumins and globulins. You probably heard of gamma globulins. Well, this is a different type of globulin. This particular large protein binds up sex steroids and transports it around in the blood. It's not the only protein to which these sex steroids bind to. They also bind, for example, to albumin. And it's a very unique protective mechanism as well. So when we test a young woman, and if she's healthy, we're going to see a reference range of what constitutes a normal amount of sex hormone binding globulin, because it's always there in someone who's menstruating. Sex hormone binding globulin is always there, as it's always there in males, because it's carrying around testosterone. So there's normal levels of sex hormone binding globulin. Now, the body has an interesting protective mechanism. For example, if a woman is given additional estrogen at a time when she's producing very rich amounts of estrogen, let's say a 25-year-old who goes on the birth control pill, that 25-year-old is pretty close to the peak amount of estrogen production that she's ever going to do. Now you're giving her extra estrogen in the form of the birth control pill. Estradiol's in that birth control pill. The body reads, wow, we were cruising around a really robust amount of rich amount and appropriate amount of estrogen, and now entered into our system is some additional estrogen. Well, we don't like elevated levels of hormones, so what can we do to adjust to this? Well, what it does is it produces additional sex hormone binding globulin and binds up the extra estradiol, or some part of it. And the sex hormone binding globulin level on a blood test increases. And sex hormone binding globulin binds up other stuff besides the estrogen. So some of these young women, it also binds up their testosterone, and they lose their libido. They go on the birth control pill and they lose their libido. Not everyone does, but some do. And it's because of that elevated sex hormone binding globulin. And just as an aside, however highly relevant, when a young woman stops the birth control pill, theoretically, there's no more need for the additional excessive sex hormone binding globulin. So the sex hormone binding globulin theoretically should return to normal. Uh-oh, it doesn't in all cases. And you've got women who are on the birth control pill for a couple months in their 20s and they enter menopause, and we always, 100% of the time, at the beginning of our treatment program, draw blood and get sex hormone binding globulin tested. Make sure the levels are normal. Well, there's a certain percentage of women that we test right there at the beginning of menopause. They should have low sex hormone binding globulin levels because they got low hormones. Some of them we see elevated sex hormone binding globulins. And the only explanation we have is that sex hormone binding globulin probably got elevated when they were on the birth control pill 20 years ago, and it just never went down. This is not an illness, an elevated sex hormone binding globulin. It's part of the body's normal homeostasis mechanism, meaning that it's how the body maintains optimal levels of anything. Now, there's other ways to elevate the sex hormone binding globulin. If you treat a woman with the right amount of estrogen or the right amount of testosterone, you probably are not going to mess with the sex hormone binding globulin, and you're not going to knock it above range. If you treat with estrogen levels or testosterone levels that are significantly higher than what a woman's body is used to, her normal protection mechanism is going to kick in, and you're going to get an elevated sex hormone binding globulin. And there are ways of treating women in menopause that I absolutely do not agree with, except in rare circumstances, of using very robust amounts of estrogen, 8 times the amount minimal, 16 times the amount that a young woman has, producing levels on 24-hour urine hormone tests that are 3 to 8 times the upper limit of normal of a young woman. Those will bring the period back, those high levels. And they are another way that sex hormone binding globulin gets elevated. We had a case presented to us in Grand Rounds yesterday of a woman who was put on one of these restore the period levels of estrogen, and she had an elevated sex hormone binding globulin. And now to address the question, because I remember that Carolyn Shapiro, there was a while ago, you asked me a very specific question. And what I read into that question was sex hormone binding globulin, ovarian hormone levels. If the sex hormone binding globulin is elevated, one way to address that is give increased amounts of hormones. And you can get that to work, but often it's a slippery slope. You increase the hormone levels, the sex hormone binding globulin level increases. You increase the hormone levels, the sex hormone. So it's this real problem in management. It's not a problem in management for someone who understands all these moving parts. That would be a significantly trained, educated, and experienced licensed healthcare provider who is specializing to some degree or another in menopause. We know how to work with this stuff. And there's even tricks to bring down the sex hormone binding globulin. Boron can do it. If it doesn't, there is a pharmaceutical medication called danazol, and it will do it. Whatever it takes, we need to bring that sex hormone binding globulin into reference range.
So, I'm sorry. So in so doing, that then allows the right amount of estrogen to get into the woman's body and not get bound up.
Do its thing, yeah.
Right.
But it's
Okay.
a dance to do it. Once there's been disturbance in that sex hormone binding globulin, sometimes it's not hard to get it to drop, and sometimes it is. And sex hormone binding globulin elevation issues are not common, They're relatively rare. However, they're common enough that the menopause method standard of care is we draw blood right after the first consultation to assess sex hormone binding globulin and also for thyroid levels. We want that basal sex hormone binding globulin. Enough times we see an elevation right in the beginning, and we know that we've got to deal with it. And if we don't see that elevation, we at least got a baseline so that in the future, if we want to test to see if someone is getting elevated sex hormone binding globulin levels, we got something to compare it to. Sex hormone binding globulin, it's normal, it's healthy, and it can be quite a challenge if it's been disturbed by early use of birth control pills or excessive hormone dosages. You got a piece of work to do there, and sometimes it's pretty straightforward. You treat a woman in menopause with hormones. It takes you between 4 and 24 hours the first year of consultation time. And in the 4-hour end of things, it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. We do a series of consultations, tweaking the dosages, designing the dosages, and it goes really well. But sometimes when it doesn't go well, one of the things I constantly instruct are those in our mastery program is, when in doubt, check the sex hormone binding globulin. If you're having a tricky time, check into that sex hormone binding globulin, because it's not the only cause of challenging adjustment processes, but it's one of them. And you want to get onto that one sooner rather than later if you can.
Thank you very much for that answer. I know sex hormone binding globulin comes up a lot. People, myself included, now I understand it better, but fear it. Question number 3.
Well, let me stop you there for a minute.
Please, yes,
Nothing
go ahead.
to fear. This is not a disease. It's part of the body's normal adjusting homeostasis tools. It's not an illness. It's not going to cause an illness. At worst, it's going to make dosage adjustment a challenge, but there hasn't been one sex hormone binding globulin problematic situation that we haven't resolved one way or another. We figure out how to do it and we do it. So it's not something to fear.
It's just something, I guess, that can be tricky, and that's where question number 3 comes in, which also has to pretty much do with question number 2 and what you just explained. But this woman is stating that, well, she says, does anyone know what the side effects are of sex hormone binding globulin in females? If it gets too high, can you actually get hot flashes, vaginal atrophy, or other estrogen symptoms? She says she keeps getting low estradiol readings, so she raises her estrogen, and it just gets worse, because she says the more I raise it, the more my skin ages and sags, and the more estrogen symptoms it seems I'm getting. And it's really, she says, kind of cuckoo to me. The last time I increased my estrogen, I got urinary issues. My estrogen seems to be falling, and I just can't figure out why all of this is happening. So you kind of explained that to us, yeah?
Well, I think it's good that you read that too. And one general thing about that question is it's coming from a woman who's having a challenge getting her menopause treatment adjusted properly. And it points out to me one of the most important things for a woman going in menopause. This is not unusual. You'd think a woman goes into menopause, she gets super low ovarian hormone levels. Here, take this pill and I'll see you in a year. No. And I mentioned this before on our Facebook Live. I polled a couple doctors and nurse practitioners who were on one of our weekly grand rounds, and I asked them, how many women patients that come to you for treatment in menopause would you say are typical? And the three most experienced, one of them simultaneously broke out into a chuckle, and the answer was 0%. And it's not a problem, it's not an illness, but these hormones are so powerful. And every single individual woman and man, for that example, we are so individual, and it just requires a process that respects that. So we got to hunker down and get a very detailed assessment of where the woman's at, and then begin treatment processes that are really headed towards helping her discover her individual amounts of hormones and balance of four ovarian hormones, not to mention thyroid and maybe even adrenal. It's a process, and there is no pat, simple answer, but it's fun. I mean, from my perspective, it's entertaining. It's biologic individuality, and it's very profound. And so, how do you respond to that level of individuality? You individualize the assessment and treatment programs. Duh. And sometimes it takes time. And like I was just saying, the first year it can take anywhere from 4 to 24 hours to figure it out. That's spread out over the course of the first 4 months. We usually get it in 4 months. And why some women are 24 hours? Because it's rare, but sometimes they're just more complex to sort it all out. But it's just a one step after another process, and that's how we figure it out, and we do it. Now, so in general, that woman presented many statements within that question that showed that she had a challenging situation. All right, we take on that challenge. And I'm not going to try and dig down into her situation because I'd have to know a lot more details. But typical it was, she increased her estrogen and she didn't get the response she thought she would. Could that be due to the elevation of the sex hormone binding globulin? It could. That's the kind of paradoxical behaviors we get with a fluctuating sex hormone binding globulin. To me, Carolyn, you're frozen. Would someone in the chat say, am I frozen too?
I'm not frozen to me.
Okay, good. And
you are, but I'm not to me.
Okay, would someone say in the chat if either Carolyn or I are frozen?
Yeah, please let us know, because
But if
we
you can
don't want to.
if you can hear us, that should do.
Well, we got to know. We're not frozen.
Good, that's good.
Yeah.
There is one other thing that can happen. Sex hormone binding globulin elevation is not a disease. I've said that a couple times here already today. However, it can cause some problems. And the woman was talking about estrogen management issues. Well, it can also bind up your testosterone, and you can lose your libido. And binding up testosterone is no picnic. I mean, we want adequate testosterone. It really matters. So I'm going to take us back to the woman presented a complex series of statements in there. She brought up the possibility of sex hormone binding globulin being an issue. And it all takes us back to the same thing. Number one, someone who's having a challenging time, or I'd say every woman who's going into menopause, you've got one job. Your job is to go shopping and find a healthcare provider who's interested in menopause, who has done special additional training, because we sure don't get it in medical school or nurse practitioner school. That statement I'm lingering on, because we sure don't get that training on how to treat women in menopause in medical school or nurse practitioner school. It's additional training that you have to reach out and seek out and actually do. And a woman, you need to go shopping for a healthcare provider who has got that special interest in menopause, has received additional training, maybe even is getting mentored, and that's who you need to find. That's your job. So a woman who's asking a complex question, she has one job to do. It's not for her to figure out estrogen and sex hormone binding globulin or whatever other moving parts are going on there that are giving her some challenges. Her job is this: keep hunting, keep shopping until you find a licensed healthcare provider who specializes in treating women in menopause. And when you do, they'll figure it out with you. There's more moving parts than sex hormone binding globulin. And that's one of the reasons I couldn't answer that woman's question, because how we would approach a woman like that is we'd start from scratch. And we'd do our 12-page medical history. We'd learn so much about what's going on in her. We'd do some testing. And then you get your first idea. Okay, we spent an hour discussing the details of your whole medical story. Here's my first idea. We deploy that idea, usually a hormone prescription, and we see how it works out. And that's how you do it, step by step by step, especially in the complex cases. There are many of them. But I don't want to make it out to be a problem. For someone who loves this work, it's entertaining. It keeps it interesting. Bring it on. So I can't tell if people can hear me, but Jenny says, and Marita says, and Nicole, that we're not frozen. So good. What do you think, Carolyn? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I'll never forget this pose of yours because you've been the same way the whole interview, and it's fine because I can hear you just fine. But people are saying we're not frozen.
That's
I
good.
think they'd let us know. I have a question, and then I want to move on to the next one. But when women are in estrogen overdose, how come the sex hormone binding globulin, this might be a wacky question, but why doesn't it kick in then?
Well, I don't know instances. I haven't tested enough women who are on excessive estrogen or testosterone dosages to make a global statement that the sex hormone binding globulin does anything but respond. It elevates. That's the natural mechanism. Now, are there exceptions to that? Yeah. And by the way, and I'm glad you're pursuing this further, we do that initial test on every single woman that's in the menopause method. We get a blood test for sex hormone binding globulin levels, even if there's no suggestion that there's an issue at all. The only reason we wait for the first consultation is very often women arrive having done a bunch of blood tests. And I don't want to order additional blood tests until I see what they've got. They may have it. They may have enough. Now, it's very rare that they've also come in with a sex hormone binding globulin. The only reason we order it at the first visit, just in case they have had it ordered before, I don't need to repeat it. Now, oh boy, I lost my train of thought there.
Well, I'd ask.
I know what it is. When we see the results of that first blood test and we see an elevated sex hormone binding globulin, especially a mildly or moderately elevated one, I don't say to the woman, oh my God, you got an elevated sex hormone binding globulin. I downplay it entirely, because what I know is in many instances, their body's adjusted to that level of sex hormone binding globulin, and we can go ahead and treat them, and the sex hormone binding globulin never interferes with good dosages, optimal dosages, which are less than a young woman. We produce estrogen levels that are less than a young menstruating woman is. So I just don't even comment necessarily, oh, you've got an elevated sex hormone binding globulin, but no problem, we're just going to go right ahead. It's just a good chance that it's not going to give us any trouble whatsoever, and it's not an illness. What I'm saying there, and I'm repeating myself, is even when I see an elevated sex hormone binding globulin on our initial routine test of sex hormone binding globulin, and I see it's elevated, I don't make a big deal of it at all. I don't even I hardly drop a beat, because I know that in the majority of women that we go ahead and treat them with ovarian hormones, that elevated sex hormone binding globulin, mild or moderate, is not going to give us any trouble. So I don't want to plant the seed that it is going to give us any trouble. I just proceed. And very often we won't even see it elevate further. It just got upregulated somewhere along the line, and we're not challenging the woman's body with excessive levels of estrogen or testosterone. So it doesn't elevate further. That's very important to know. It's not an illness, and it's not a problem, and what I'm really saying is, even if it's a little bit elevated, a lot of times it's not a problem whatsoever. So don't blink an eye, just go ahead. There is another thing that can elevate sex hormone binding globulin: excessive doses of thyroid hormone. And believe you me, we run into this, where someone's being overtreated with thyroid hormone. It's hard to overtreat someone with thyroid hormone or any of these hormones. They're so powerful, they lead to so many side effects that very few people tolerate overdoses of thyroid or any other hormone. But some do, and if there's an excessive level of thyroid hormone treatment, it too can raise that sex hormone binding globulin. So you got to pay attention to that too. We routinely get 4 different thyroid blood tests. I mean, 4 analytes in one blood draw. We're not drawing the blood 4 times. And because that can be not common, but it certainly can be a reason why that sex hormone binding globulin is elevated. We want to adjust that. We don't want excessive levels of thyroid hormone. Thus and so. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute myself for some reason. But here I am. And thank you for that. You know, we do discuss sex hormone binding globulin a lot, and my huge appreciation to you is that you do not mind repeating yourself, and I'm so grateful for that, because we have a lot of new women here, we have a lot of confused women here, and there's such beauty, I think, in repetition. And I think
See if I
it
can address what you just stated there, Carolyn. It's such an important statement. A lot of confused women. I wish it wasn't so, but the whole field of treating women in menopause, there's very few people who get good at it or expert at it. And so women are left to their own devices, and they wander into this world where there's a lot of complexity, because the human body is complexity. And they're having challenges themselves, and there is a lot of confusion out there. And that's sad, and we're working on it. We're trying to train up as many physicians and nurse practitioners so a woman won't have to be confused. She can do the one thing that is very important for her to do. For one thing, she's going to have to connect with a licensed healthcare provider, because that's the only way someone can write a prescription for the hormones. They have to be properly licensed. We're talking about a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a PA. That's it. Some states, even compounding pharmacists can prescribe. And so you're going to have to find a licensed healthcare provider to get hormones. And it's right that you do, because to get hormones right is a piece of work. There's a knowledge base there. There's an experience base that really matters. Your job is going to find the one that you like, to find the healthcare provider, a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a PA, or a prescribing compounding pharmacist that you trust, and that has taken on the field of treating women in menopause with compounded bioidentical hormones with a gusto, because they love it, because it's very rewarding work. And they're interested in it, and they're fascinated by it. And they're even going so far as to specialize in it. That's your only job. So the confusion needs to translate into that action. You're going into great depth as a woman to understand this. I understand that any intellectual challenge, we'd love to go in and figure it out, a lot of us. But that's not your job. because the only resolution you're ever going to get is someone's got to prescribe those hormones, and you want to find someone who knows what they're doing. I'm not trying to dissuade you from understanding this. My God, I wrote a book designed for women called Happy Healthy Hormones. Carolyn's got it up on the ins and outs of menopause. You can download a free PDF copy of it. I think the more you know, great. But the job becomes the same. And I'm taking off on the word confusion, Carolyn, because you know how many times you hear that. And I know how many times I hear that. Confusion needs to translate into a specific action called, I got to get these hormones right. I got to find a licensed healthcare provider that knows what they're doing. That's my main job. That's where I'm going to put my time and energy and attention. And these days with telemedicine and how wonderful treating women in menopause works with telemedicine, you got access to your every single healthcare provider in your whole state. You don't have to find someone in your city. You just have to find someone in your state that is specializing in hormone and is doing telemedicine. They can treat you just as well as someone who lives next door to you. You don't have to see them in person. You do have to see your primary care provider or your gynecologist for annual checkups and any other health issues that take place. But yeah, that's the word confusion. Sorry to interrupt you, Carolyn, but that word confusion really matters.
Well, it does. And, a little bit of a side note, back in 2015, I guess, is when a lot of these groups and forums came up and it exploded. I mean, women were so happy that we were finally talking about menopause, that hush, hush, don't, talk about this thing. And it's been wonderful to be able to discuss menopause with other women. The caution is to not caution, but exactly what you just said. Find that person in your state who knows what he or she is doing, is licensed, can write a prescription, and has a passion for menopause and treating women in it and men in andropause. Can be a little tricky to do, but it's doable. I did it. Took me a while, but I did it. And oh man, did that ever change things? So my prescription, and I can't write prescriptions, but it always says, hang in there. that's my big prescription, because it's so important. It really is. And the word confusion definitely is a biggie. And I thank you for your answer and taking the time to even address confusion, because there is a lot of it out there. But it can all funnel into making sense. I know that. Um, so thank you for that. Because we have a little bit of time left, to address this question, because I think this one's going to be like a three-part question for our interviews. A woman's been taking compounded bioidentical hormones for 23 years, and she has used the menopause method, actually. But she's stating that her research says that DHEA lowers cortisol levels, and she says that her DHE levels and cortisol levels are like rock bottom. And she'd like to take more testosterone because she felt a really, really great sense of well-being. But now, for whatever reason, due to these low DHEA and cortisol levels, she says she's a complete emotional mess. Her skin feels like it's sandpaper-like, and so she totally stopped the DHEA, hence low. And she's wondering if you've ever heard of DHEA giving such a strange result, and she's very confused, because at 23 years, everything's going a little bit wonky, and she wanted to know if you could expound on that a little bit.
There's that word confusion, and
Yep.
I'm gonna get to her question in just a minute. I want to tell you, it's such a common situation that myself and other menopause specialists face. A woman comes to us. She's confused. She's had she's tried different treatment plans. They don't necessarily work. It's discouraging. So many women come to their initial visit, they're discouraged. Not all, of course, but a certain significant percentage of women have tried different providers, different methods, and they're not quite feeling right, or they're not feeling right at all. And this is a very, very common experience. First visit, this is who I meet up with. They put in a lot of time and energy and caring, and they've gone through different providers and different methods, and it's not working. But I want to tell you a common event that then takes place. We dig in, we really learn a lot about a woman, we come up with ideas, we implement a program, we fine tune it over the course of the first 3 months or even a year. And then there comes that magic moment that when the woman says something like, "Oh my God, I'm myself again." I want to tell you that there's a lot of women who've had a lot of challenge with this because there's a lot of moving parts. And so many of those women who get proper care, they come out the other end going, "Wow, this is amazing. Got my libido back. I'm losing weight. My skin's good again. The woman in me is restored. I can feel her. She had disappeared. She'd gone away, etc., etc., etc. My vagina's back. I no longer need lubricant. My bones are replenishing. My gut." So I just want to say that although confusion and discouragement can be a very common experience out there for women who've been trying to figure out menopause, trying to get to the right provider, I want to tell you that it's so common in our experience that sooner or later we figure it out and the woman goes, "Oh, this is fantastic," or "I'm so grateful. Oh, myself is back." So I don't want to leave you with that discouragement. I want to lead you that the most common thing that happens is women find the right provider and we sort it out. And a month, 2, 3, 4 months, even longer sometimes, they're going, "Glory, hallelujah. I had lost myself and now I'm found again." Now to that woman's question. I don't know where she got this information about DHEA. Please send Carolyn or myself the reference. But here's the thing. There's many hormones in your body. They come out of the ovary, they come out of the adrenal gland. For example, DHEA comes out of the ovary and the adrenal gland. DHEA is either a prohormone, that means it's converted to something else, it's hormonally active. And in women, DHEA can convert to testosterone. So you can give a woman DHEA and she can produce testosterone. That won't happen in men. You can't do that with men. You can't get their testosterone up by giving them DHEA. These are generalizations, but they're very often true. That's why they're generalizations. But here's what happens. A woman, age 20, is producing out of her adrenal glands and her ovaries and her thyroid the maximum amount of hormone that she's probably ever going to do in her whole life. Oh, it could be 18 or it could be 22, somewhere in there. That's when she peaks out. And all of these hormones decline. Every one of them. And it's pretty rare to see a woman in her 50s. I mean, rare. It's remarkable to see a woman who's got adequate DHEA. No, very low. Low testosterone. And if she stopped menstruating, low estrogen, low progesterone, low testosterone, it's almost a certainty. And there's reasons why the DHEA gets special pressure on it. Well, all these hormones are recruited for the biology of the fight or flight response. But then the natural loss of the ovarian function, you can come up with whatever philosophical reason you want why the ovaries stop working, but they do. And the bottom line is, I don't understand a statement that you made in there, or it's not my experience. Here's what we do. We replenish every hormone that needs it. And when the ovaries go, sooner or later, every woman needs estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and DHEA. And I've never run across an exception. And I've never had a problem replenishing the DHEA and testosterone levels. Sometimes you have to work at it, but that's it. It always works. And so I can't address this woman's situation. It's the kind of thing where what I'm going to recommend for her is there's so many missing pieces to the story she's telling, but there's reasons in there. So what do? You find a healthcare provider who specializes in treating women in menopause with compounded bioidentical hormones. They have a process. And that process is going to begin with an extensive medical history. And that's going to give them the clues on how to proceed with this woman. They're probably going to do some medical testing, and you just follow the bouncing ball and you restore all those hormones to decency. That's the process. She needs someone who really knows what they're doing.
You know, she's a very bright woman. She's in her 70s, and she really has figured this out, and she's really incredible. And like I said, the question is going to go on for another couple of interviews. I presented one part of it. Do you have you ever heard of the sandpaper skin thing, like
Well,
rough?
yes, and this will be my final answer because I know my next commitments come up. Sandpaper skin, oh boy, the skin relies on healthy hormone levels. Oh boy, does it majorly. And when those hormones go, especially the estrogens, holy mackerel, the skin dries up, gets thin, gets unhealthy. Take a look at a woman who's not being treated with hormones and look at, and she's in her 70s or 80s. Look at her skin. It is so different than a 40-year-old skin. Or women who have been treated with hormones, especially those right out of the gate, they can be in their 70s and they can have beautiful skin. Sandpaper skin, all kinds of skin changes happens when you lose your estrogen. Absolutely. Also thyroid. If your thyroid's not up to speed, and functional hypothyroidism is epidemic, that means you don't have thyroid disease, but your thyroid's not putting out what it used to and certain sufficient. So skin, oh God, it's so hormone dependent. The French knew that 50, 80 years ago. They started putting hormones in their expensive skin creams. They didn't tell anybody about it, but they were doing it. And I have word is that the many skin creams are still contain hormones that aren't being mentioned in there. But Carolyn and everybody, it's time for me to complete for today and go on to my next commitment.
I always want to sing that Mickey Mouse song, you know, now it's time to say goodbye.
Right.
I'll spare you. Anyway, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, ladies, for coming up. Got the questions, and we will be back on Thursday to continue. Dr. Rosensweet, have a wonderful, wonderful day, ladies. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. You know where to reach me and Dr. R, and we will see everybody on Thursday. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
really.
And have a really good weekend. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Weekend? Wait, what is today? Today Thursday?
Yeah.
It is? Oy, I never know my days. God almighty. Well, we're just going to change up the whole week for me. I'm sorry. We will talk on Tuesday.
All
Have
right.
a fabulous weekend.
You
See
too.
everybody later.
Bye bye, everybody.